Charlie Brain joined the Water Hygiene Centre in 2010 as a risk assessor, progressing them through to project manager, and now he holds the position of senior consultant and authorising engineer. Charlie looks after WHC's clients in the southwest of England and provides a range of services, including auditing, project design reviews, water safety training, appraisals, water safety plans, and he carries out incident investigations. Additionally, Charlie participates in large NHS water safety groups, focusing very much on public health and safety. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Charlie to deliver his presentation.
Thanks, Anna. Just checking that you can hear me all nicely. Thank you. I'll attempt to share my screen. Okay, how is that looking? Is that all okay? Thanks, Anna, for your nod. Yes, welcome everyone. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for allowing me to talk about risk assessments today, and particularly the British standard for Legionella risk assessment. So what makes me okay to talk about this? As Anna said, yes, I've been in the industry for 14 years now, starting off with actually delivering risk assessment. About 2014, the company I worked for, Water Hygiene Centre, decided to start to look at the British standard and try and comply with it ourselves. So we went for a bit of a big method change, big report change, and to satisfy those requirements. And then what we also did was look to get that accredited, and using the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, UCAS. They took a couple of years of coming out, trying to shape us and get us accredited. And then I think now we're only one of 13 accredited companies to deliver that UCAS accredited service that complies with the British standard. But soon after that, I started to implement all those changes and keep that accreditation to this standard. And probably 5 years ago, I left that kind of part of things and went to do consultancy services such as authorising engineer, as Anna just mentioned. So without further ado, I'll check the first slide. Hopefully that'll all work nicely. Thank you very much. So topics to be covered. So 4 main parts to this. So actual Legionella risk assessments and actually why we need them in the first place. And then we'll look at the standard itself and what it includes. Then perhaps looking at reasons why or why not your current risk assessments comply or not. And then some key points to take away. So come straight back to basics. If you know your health and safety law, so we have to dip right back into the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regs 1999. Hope you're all aware of those, which as a minimum, we need to sort of place arrangements to control health and safety risks. We know that kind of water does represent risks with it, so that this falls in nicely. And within those arrangements, we should have a written policy, assessments of risk to your employees or contractors, clients, customers, partners, or any people using your services or your building. Record those findings in writing if you're more than 5 employees, as we all know. Any risk assessment then should be suitable and sufficient to how complex your situation is. Then we need arrangements for the effective planning, organisation, control, monitoring, review of preventative and protective measures that come from the risk assessment, so a bit of evidence there. Access to competent help and advice, particularly if we don't have that internally. It's always good to look at external consultants. Then providing employees with information about those risks in the workplace and make sure they're protected. Instruction and training for everyone to how to deal with them, and then making sure the adequate, appropriate supervision in place. So consulting with employees about the risks at work and letting them know. So that's that regulation. Another regulation that we're all probably aware of is IOSH. So typically, sometimes this gets sort of pigeonholed into bleach, but it does go into a bit more, all biological hazards, which bacteria and pathogens are in water, so this falls under nicely. And then once again, it's a similar pattern. So we have to assess the risk arising from hazardous substances created by your workplace or activities, and then decide what precautions are needed to reduce that risk. So you can sort of comply with IOSH then, prevent and adequately control that exposure, and we have that hierarchy of control that you can see on the screen there. The difficulty with Legionella is it's a naturally occurring bacteria that is difficult to eliminate if you have water, and particularly it's not sterile, so it comes from our public mains. We're not told to eliminate it, we have to control. So we can almost go straight down to the second step of our IOSH hierarchy there. And then we have our control measures, so that's all written down. We monitor the effect of those, make sure they're working. So we have records, i.e. temperature checks, etc., or some sampling to make sure everything's working as it should. And once again, training, plans, procedures. So a similar sort of theme to the health and safety regs there we have through IOSH. If you've read those two, congratulations. You may have not mentioned, not noticed it doesn't mention Legionella. So we have approved code of practices, and number 8 is our Legionella one there. You can see on the screen, or L8 sometimes it's called. Sometimes gets misquoted as a regulation itself. These are not regulations, they are guidance documents to help you comply with your statutory requirements and those regulations. So this is a free download from the HSE website. It's very wordy. There are supporting documents that are a bit more pictorial and photographic, which will help you. But this is mainly aimed at duty holders or the responsible person to read through and make sure their organisation is complying with health and safety regulation in terms of water and particularly Legionella. But it has what's known as a quasi-legal status. So if you don't do what's in this, you have to prove that you're doing something as suitable and sufficient to prove that you are doing what you should be doing. So it's going against the HSE a little bit, which is perhaps unwise. So most people would follow what's written in here. So how it's structured, it will take extracts from the regulations, and then underneath it, it will say, okay, how does this relate to water and Legionella specifically? And within that, it talks about risk assessment. So there is a requirement to have that suitable and sufficient risk assessment for Legionella. So we do need to have it, and it must be completed by a competent person. Then we go down one step further, and in 2013, the HSE kind of exploded the ACOP. It all used to be in one, but they exploded it out, and now we have the HSG 274 documents, also free downloads. And this is the more colourful pictures guidance document to help us manage water systems. And in there, it gives you the type of water systems that we need to have risk assessed. So we have cooling towers, which are seen as a very high inherent risk for Legionella, particularly because it can expose a lot of people very quickly. We've perhaps all seen cooling towers around, particularly the large natural draft cooling towers you might see at power plants. So this falls into this nicely, along with hot and cold water systems, which actually have more associated outbreaks with Legionella, Legionnaires disease with these types of systems than cooling towers. That's a misconception there. Looking at spa pools and any other type of equipment that uses water and can expose people to particularly the aerosol it can create. So we have these types of systems, and they can be as weird and wacky as you can think of, and new things are always coming onto the market, particularly sort of features or humidifiers or anything like that. They do need a risk assessment put in place. What this document will then lead you on to any other industry guidance that might give you a bit more help. I'm looking at spa pools there. It does talk about, it's got its own separate guidance document, HSG 282 off the top of my head, and then PUTAG, which is kind of the governing body for all things swimming pools. So it does then refer you to more specific guidance. Depending what type of water system and size of organisation you have, it can be from the smallest, say, shop, to the largest hospital trust or council building or anything you can think of. They try and help you decide what's proportional. So in that document, HSG 274, it gives some examples of what they consider to be a low risk water system, particularly inherently. And this is an example they give. So in a small building, without people particularly susceptible to it. So we're looking at those elderly, immunocompromised, sort of healthcare sort of people. So if it's a staff-only building, general public, you can tick that one straight away. Where that daily water usage is inevitable and it turns over at least a few times a day. So think of your house. We turn over a lot of water in there compared to the size of it. So there's a lower risk there that water's going to sort of start to stand still and stagnate. Where it comes straight from the town mains, public mains, we don't then store it in a cold water tank. Where it's the hot water is generated by low point of use water heaters, so low storage, so not centralized chlorifiers that circulate hot water around a large building. These are the small under sink little white boxes that you might have in your offices, particularly up to 15 litres it gives that limit. And where you just have toilets and wash basins, so showers. So going back to that aerosol creation. So it's just giving you a typical example. So then we might not need elaborate control measures. You still need a risk assessment, but it doesn't have to be particularly long or detailed, but we need to put in some things in place. But it's helping you kind of proportionalize things a little bit. Also in that document, it does have almost a specification, but things that you should have in a risk assessment, but doesn't go into any great detail, which is what we will come on to shortly. So why else do we need them? For those couple of slides was basically saying because we have to. Health and safety law says we should. So there's a compliance aspect, but there's also the risk aspect. Unfortunately, bacteria, we get affected by bacteria in lots of different ways. Bacteria thrives in water and people get ill from it. So there is this risk of illness created by the Legionella bacteria, Legionella disease being one of them. So it is reportable through RIDDOR, any cases confirmed. We used to have good monthly stats from Public Health England, or the UK HSA as they're now called, which stopped from COVID, and they haven't quite started up again. But we used to have monthly stats, as you see on screen. So each month we'll get the confirmed cases against an average of the previous 3 years. And you can see on the screen that about 500 in 2019. And that sort of varied 300, 400. There was 1 year of 800. A lot of that depends on I guess, how much they do manage to find or diagnose is the big one. A lot of it is underdiagnosed. They opt straight to something else or an antibiotic without actually having a diagnosis. So numbers are quite low. And it's always a slow news day if we ever hear about an outbreak, but it do happen. If you want to Google it, some news on Legionella, I'm sure you'll find incidents of schools or hotels or anything that might have a problem, and hopefully not that it's caused an outbreak so someone hasn't caught it. But we do hear about it, but you've kind of got to go and look for it a little bit. And one question like we always get asked on this is why higher in the summer? Usually to do with obviously warmer cold water, buildings heating up, more holidays being taken abroad in those months, more use of air conditioning. So there's lots of different factors why we see a bit more of an increase in the summer, particularly sort of late summer usually. Okay, so British Standard. So 2010 was the first draft of this, or say draft, first version of this. It was aimed to kind of take out the variation of how these looked and kind of standardize it a little bit. So assessments didn't become over-spec'd or even under-spec'd. And whereas the ACOP L8 and HSG 274 tell you kind of what should be in the key elements, doesn't tell you how to do it, and it's not very detailed. So this gives you a bit more. Unfortunately, this one's not free. You have to pay for a British Standard. It can be quite expensive, but you might be able to get it through who you work for, and I'm not quite sure. But it's worth to get. So they detail the need to have this suitable and sufficient assessment completed by a competent person. So the same two lines there. So what should that really include or consider? So one of the main differences that we found all those years ago is it's no longer just a look at the water system. An assessor doesn't just turn up to the door, doesn't go, right, okay, where's the water come in, and then show us around your water system. I'll just look at the water system and then leave, and say, basically undertake a condition survey, how clean something is, what the temperature is, and then go, there you go, fine. It does go into a bit more detail, particularly with, you can see sort of section 6 on the slide there. So we have to look a lot more at your documents. And we'll go into that a bit more detail in the next couple of slides. So there's a bit more paper exercise as well as the physical looking around. So as just details, it's not just a condition survey, we have to look at more things. And to help us to consider factors in risk assessment, they've come up with these risk factors here. We have contamination, amplification, transmission, exposure, and susceptibility. Some people shorten this to CATES, they call it. So you should be able to see this in your risk assessment. They should have considered these risk factors. And what these mean, so contamination, that's kind of the risk of the water supply itself, and whether it's public mains, which once again is not sterile. It does have bacteria in it. They do put a disinfectant in it, but bacteria will still grow. You could be using rainwater, groundwater, or you could use sterile water or RO water if you wanted to spend some money, but usually it's public main. So usually that sort of risk is fairly similar throughout a building sort of scope, or lots of different sites around the country. Some are more hard water versus soft water. Legionella does like hard water, does like scale. So that might come into this factor as well. Then the amplification factor, that's okay, we need to amplify the situation, so we need to grow it. Legionella comes in low numbers into your building, but it needs to find a home, needs to find somewhere warm, and it needs some food. So a bit like us, really. So how much food are you giving it? So scale, rust, organic matter, materials of construction, need something to feed on, biofilms, etc. And then it likes temperature, so there's warm temperatures, particularly between 20 and 45 degrees. Perfect temperature is about 37, so body temperature. So avoiding those water temperatures. Moving on to transmission. So yeah, you can have these things, but you need to get that water into the air. Legionella is a lung-loving bacteria. To start those or produce those diseases, it needs to get into your lungs and then cause those pneumonia-like symptoms. So it needs to get into the air. We need to breathe it in and get it into our lungs. And the more you do that, and how well you do that, the worse, I guess. More showers, more sprays, more aerosols, the sort of higher risk of transmission there is. And then finally, exposure. So, okay, we've created an aerosol. So how close are people to that aerosol and how long are they exposed to it? A couple of good examples I can think of. We used to have nebulizers, which used to be washed out in the water and put really quite close to your face. Obviously, you couldn't get much closer to that source. And then standing around a spray, perhaps water features, water fountains in a city square somewhere. People tend to look at it for quite a while. You might be able to feel that spray on your face. So that would be given a risk rating as well for the exposure. And finally, susceptibility. So, okay, we might have a problem, we've created something, but depending on who might breathe it in, will increase or decrease that risk of something bad happening. So very similar again to all sort of health and safety risk assessments. A lot depends on who is actually exposed to that risk or who uses those, I don't know, chemicals or anything you could think of. So that will come into it as well. So your risk assessment should have these detailed and how you can minimize or eliminate parts of these risk factors to help you be in control. With susceptibility, just to sort of hammer this home a little bit, can't often see risk assessments that are sort of deemed high risk, and it might be for a library, and sometimes that's quite hard to believe, particularly when you have lots of risk assessments to deal with across lots of scope of your county council, and it's quite unhelpful because they need to concentrate on where all the risks are to do with susceptibility. So NHS trusts or hospital trusts are always kind of the higher risk buildings, and that's quite a sensible thing to say, isn't it? Particularly when it comes to bacteria, the more ill or susceptible you are to something, the higher the risk should be. So there should be an assessment of that susceptibility risk, which is not always the same from building to building. Okay. So another huge part of the British standard is competence, and it's something that we're always trying to prove or fight with in health and safety is we need to prove competence. And you can, as an organisation, undertake your own risk assessment, but once again, you need to prove you are competent to do so. So most people looked to contractors. And there are, which we'll go on to in a second, accreditations or memberships of contractors to help you determine that risk assessor is competent or not. And there's lots of different training courses for risk assessors to go on. So that is vitally important to make sure that you have the right risk assessor assess your water systems that they're experienced with and are regularly checked for their competence to do that. And back to our guidance document, our ACOP L8 is once again emphasised in that the duty holder or landlord, employer, whoever it is, must ensure that person is competent to do so. And there's those two sort of accreditations or memberships. So the Legionella Control Association is a membership. They do have a code of practice for organisations to meet, and they are getting better at auditing organisations to undertake risk assessments, and they do use the British standard now to kind of judge whether a risk assessment is good enough or it needs to improve to keep their membership to that association. So that's a way of doing it without having to do it yourself. And then a step up from that is UCAS. They will use the British standard as their base, their technical document to sort of accredit that risk assessment to an ISO standard. And then they have their own ISO standard. It's a conformity assessment, they call it, which has their own specification of what should be in it, but they also use the British standard to help guide them to give that accreditation. And there are a couple of hundred or 200 or 300 companies who can do risk assessment, who are LCA members, but so at the start, I think it's only 13 companies have gone for the UCAS accreditation on that. So the condition survey, I kind of mentioned at the start, when we just look at water temperatures, look around water systems, note condition. That's not a risk assessment, that is a condition survey. This is dirty, clean it. So we do see that quite a lot. It's also a risk assessment is also not a treasure hunt. I like to say we shouldn't. A risk assessor shouldn't go into a building blind. It's not a test. They should be given access to the previous risk assessment and your control scheme and report. So if your risk assessment hasn't gone through that to understand the current risk, how you are dealing with things, it's going to struggle to hit that British standard mark. So that needs to happen. So it's coming more and more time spent on paperwork than actually going out and looking around the system. But that is the way we're going. We can learn a lot more by what you're doing rather than going around in a snapshot of time, particularly when it comes to temperature monitoring. Because say temperature monitoring is a big part of a risk assessment. We need to understand how the temperatures are working to control bacteria. We learn a lot more from looking at, say, 12 months worth of data than going around in a snapshot of time in that hour or so, and then judging everything by that. So it's really important the risk assessor sees as much paperwork as possible and also sees all your assets. So like I said, it's not a treasure hunt. If you do not know your assets, it's always good to go around with them, making sure they see every room, etc., every plant room, to make sure they don't miss anything. So this is the type of documents they need to see. So you've got a current control scheme, maintenance and testing records, so PPM, some people call them, or monitoring records. Your management responsibilities, so policies, procedures, training records, how you safely operate systems, so sort of task descriptions or SOPs, etc. And then a look all through your logbooks. So one thing we'll pick up on there is training of yourself. So an RP will need to be trained, because if they don't, how it creates a bad management, doesn't it? So how good is the RP's knowledge and understanding of what is required, particularly when bad things happen? So that lack of training of an RP can then cascade down through organisation and reflect quite badly on Legionella risk, because they're not going to manage it properly. What else does it include according to the British standard? Well, after the desktop appraisal, the assessor no doubt will then go and look around all your assets, all your risk systems, plant rooms, so cold water tanks, hot water clarifiers or generators, then around all your outlets, looking at pipe work, looking at taps, sink, showers, you name it. And they might have to produce an asset register, which can be then quite useful to inform a written scheme and then your monitoring setup or PPM. So you need to look at that. And if they do, as it's highlighted on the screen, see something that was classed as an imminent danger, so a big failure of the control scheme. So if you've chosen temperature as your control scheme, which most do, if it has particularly failed, they will issue that imminent danger, and they should tag that at the time. So you don't have to wait for a report for any nasty surprises. They should tell you, you need to fix this now. And that can be extended to perhaps any gross contamination or stagnation of the cold water tank, or even a asset that you were not aware of. So often myself found cold water tanks that the organisation didn't know it was there. So therefore it wasn't being managed or looked at or inspected. So it was like, okay, you need to do this now. So that represented an imminent danger as well. Yeah, so that's also important to be said is it's not a drive-by. I mean, risk assessments do vary in quality and also time it takes to do them. It's always a bit of a worry when I see, say, a hospital risk assessment being done in a day or two. I know they've not spent enough time, as that's through my experience, but it can be a bit of a copy and paste exercise sometimes, which is sad to say, but we do. And then we've had examples where actually during a rota of risk assessments for a council, they actually received a report of a property that actually burnt down 6 months previous. So it was a bit of a drive-by using the same photos and just updating a few bits and then sending the bill in. So you do get all sorts in this industry. So it's always good to be with a risk assessor when you do a risk assessment, so you know what they see and you can talk with them and get knowledge that way as well. Okay, and there's a picture of a drive-by. Okay, so measurements. So yes, like I said, temperature monitoring for a risk assessor is quite bad, quite important. We need to understand how your water system is functioning, how it's performing. So they will undertake that, but they also go through your records as well, making sure that whoever takes the temperatures within your organisation is competent to do so. They've been trained, and the tools that they use, their thermometers are all calibrated and they can be trusted. Because if they're not, or you don't have particular good records in place, the assessor might actually go and take more temperatures to satisfy themselves and get a better understanding. We are getting into a technological era, so there are sensors, BMS sensors, and temperature sensors around, which gives us that instant information via a piece of software of constant monitoring. So that's hugely useful for a risk assessor to see and examine and get themselves into. Okay, so testing for Legionella or sampling. Some risk assessment companies will automatically do this. It's not a sort of prerequisite. You don't have to have a water sample taken as part of a risk assessment. It can be a little bit of a money spinner for a company to come and do this. They might be, say, looking for problems, particularly if they do follow-up remedial work. So that's something to bear in mind. You do want your, it's a good guide to have your risk assessors independent and impartial as much as possible. A lot of companies do additional services, so they might have a bit of a vested interest to find certain things which then they can come and do the work for. It's sort of a cynical point of view, but that's just through experience. So it's not required. The British Standard does give us some tips on when you might want to take a sample. So if we do encounter that novel piece of equipment that we don't think is known about or being managed, so we want to just check whether that's okay. Whether there is a failure of control measures, they might take some samples and make sure everything's actually okay, and you're not going to grow any Legionella until you fix the problem. To do some verification of making sure what you've got in place works. Okay, a lot of people would use that. Or the assessor has a reason to doubt the validity of the tests. Once again, from a cynical point of view, you can spot falsified records quite easily when you've seen enough of them. Over a month's worth of data with the same color pen, same handwriting, slightly moving away from the line, you can see it quite quickly. So is there any doubt, the risk assessor might take some samples, but the reality is that decision would be decided at the scoping stage. So when they need to cost for it, obviously, and you might have that conversation with the risk assessor. Actually, do you want to take some samples as you can because we've got some doubts or some problems, and because a lot of risk assessors are not equipped to do so at the time. So they might not have all the bottles with them that have use by dates. They might not have a lab lined up to start testing the water within the required sort of 1 to 2 days. So usually it is a decision to be made before they come on site, but sometimes it's not. But there is a British standard of how to take a Legionella sample as well. That's BS 7592. That was recently updated a couple of years ago. So anyone taking water samples obviously have to be competent to do so, as well as do the risk assessment. But there's a guide, well, that's the British standard of how to do it. So the technique of doing it, because we do see it done wrong quite frequently. Okay, what else does it need to include? So we should have a sort of a rating system or a logical method of assessing the risk. Both the LA and British Standard doesn't give you an example. It doesn't tell you how to do a risk assessment. It just says that you need one. You can use a matrix, etc. But so every risk assessment you see is slightly different. And just because they say they comply with British Standard doesn't mean there's a set way of doing it. And then you have lots of variants then as well. But you should have a defined scoring method, which is easily sort of read and understood by the person using it. There's a few pointers on here to bear in mind that it shouldn't be a risk. So you might see at the front of your report might say risk high or moderate. One thing is to avoid that because usually they've used, okay, the highest risk they found will define the whole site, or they'll use an average across all risks, and then give you a bit of an average. So it's quite a dangerous thing to do. So as long as you'll say a water system or a finding has a risk associated with it, that's more useful for the duty holder, responsible person, then to go straight away to that particular place or system to concentrate on. So yeah, there are some logical scoring systems out there, but the British Standard helps you kind of along that way of doing it properly. Here's an example, sort of 5 by 5. You might use these in your daily work, but one thing to think about here is, okay, likelihood, impact, or consequence. You could say the likelihood is, okay, we have the likelihood of growing Legionella, for example, how bad the water system is or being managed. And then the impact or consequence of that is really, okay, it depends on who breathes that in. The consequence is it going to cause problems? So there's that susceptibility factor coming in at the end there, which is really important. Okay. The British Standard says that the report should be clear and concise. It's very objective, but they do vary in clarity and conciseness. They should not have repeating, huge chapters on guidance, so extracts from LA or HSG to kind of like pad out the risk assessment. They should not be doing that. They shouldn't have the history of Legionella in there. You sometimes see that. It gives you basically a training manual in there of the ecology of things. You don't need to know that. It's not a training manual. I shouldn't say the RP needs to do this. Typically, it's not what it's for. It's not a written scheme either. So it's not a set of procedures. It's literally, this is the ingredients. These are the problems you have. The risk assessment is critical to the preparation of the written scheme. So you take the written scheme, take the findings, whether it's the assets or the risk, and then that gives you action plans, and then it'll form the written scheme and procedures part of things. So having it real fluffed out with stuff that you don't need to know is quite a thing to avoid, and that's what the British Standard says here. You also have an action plan, or some people call it a risk minimization scheme. So a prioritized by risk set of actions. They could give you some deadlines, but more importantly, it's for the organization to just determine those priorities and deadlines, because an assessor doesn't know how budgets work, for example, and how much money you have. So it's very important. They'll just prioritize by risk. Then the organisation should then put deadlines to them to make sure they're workable and they are agreed by a responsible person. Or if you have a water safety group, they're aware of all those actions, and then they'll put them into a better order than the risk assessor could do, a more achievable and workable order. Okay, so it's kind of a broad overview of what the British Standard needs. There is a lot more, but it gives a bit of a flavour, and it's obviously worth buying that document or using the LCA, or even better, UCAS, to do that hard work for you. So hopefully that's got sort of your mind racing a little bit, but you can use that sort of guide that you got on the screen. So, okay, that's sort of things that we should have in our assessment. And should be sort of doing that audit to make sure that we are complying with the British Standard. So some key points to take away. The Legionella risk assessments are a requirement. We do need them. We do need them in place via regulation, and there's lots of guidance to help us or inform us on how to do that and what should be in it. Guidance details what needs to be assessed, but doesn't tell you how. So you'll see lots of variations of reports and scoring matrices and how they do it. What they're looking for should be the same. Whether it's records or temperatures or going around a system, they should all be trained on what to look for, where the risks are. It's just how they might display that in their report will vary, but the guts should be the same. And that British Standard that came out in 2010 was updated in 2019. Does detail the approach for doing it. And you should really look for sort of memberships as well. So you've got the LCA, you've got UCAS to help you hit that requirement. And then another note at the bottom there for competency. So when you employ a risk assessor, have they had experience and are they competent to undertake a risk assessment in your type of building and of your type of system? So are they competent to look at cooling towers? Are they competent to go around hospital water systems? Have they looked at your type of water heater before? These sorts of questions need to be asked to make sure you're getting a quality risk assessment. There is a part 2 to this British standard, recently came out in 2022. That is to look at another waterborne pathogen, that's Pseudomonas aeruginosa. That is kind of a dual risk assessment between the engineering side and clinical in mainly a hospital setting. So there's some more information about risk assessment in there, but not particularly relating to Legionella. I think that is it from me. I will just say that we do offer weekly blogs. If you've not signed up to them, please do. They do go out on social media, on LinkedIn, etc. But you can get them sent through to you. They're very informative. There's free guidance, free knowledge at the end of the day. We also have some academy videos on how to undertake sampling, how to do temperature monitoring, how to undertake flushing. So some useful videos there we use ourselves in training, and clients tend to keep for refreshers. So they're there via our website. So please, you got the QR code there. Please receive some free blogs if you already haven't. And also the HSC website as well will lead you to various places. And if you also want a British standard, obviously just use Google, the best way to go. Google those British standard codes and you'll be directed to the right place. But no, thank you for listening. I'm not sure if there's any questions. Those pop up, but I think it's a time for questions and answers. So thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Charlie. That was really informative. Gives a really good insight as practitioners to firstly understand how we might assess competency of potential risk assessors, but also then to be able to scrutinise, interpret, and ultimately act on risk assessment. So thank you for that. I'll hand over to Trudy and Sharon, who have been monitoring the chat.
Hi, I think Sarah, you've done an amazing job in answering all the questions. So as I'm going down them, I don't think there's anything that you haven't answered on there, and everybody's got back to you with a thumbs up, thanks, etc., for the informative information shared. So Trudy, can you see anything there?
There's just one from Hilary that says, will GP practices tend to sit at medium risk or high risk? I suppose that's subjective.
Yeah, it depends on the water system, doesn't it? So if it's a high risk of, I'm kind of guessing here, of susceptibility, perhaps that certain people that go in there, it does determine how that risk assessment determines what and how many categories they have. It's low, medium, significant, high. You get a range, but not the highest of the high susceptibility. They tend to be the ITUs, cancer cares, neonatal, renal of hospitals, those kind of wards there where the immune system is right down. Obviously, anyone with those symptoms or conditions can go into a GP surgery. Obviously, that can happen, but there kind of has to be this line drawn somewhere what's typical, because someone with underlying conditions can walk into a library, but a library's water system isn't going to be the same or isn't needed to be the same as a cancer care hospital, because that's just not suitable and sufficient. So you're probably looking between the mediums and the highs, aren't you? It's a healthcare building, so that will align with, there are HTMs out there, guidance documents that kind of up it a gear from the ACOP, L8 and HSGs, to kind of like bump things up. I mean, for example, everywhere, so ACOP and HSG will tell you to make sure you've got 50 degrees hot water at your outlet, and HTM it says 55. So just easy example there, but it just moves things up. So a GP practice would fall under HCMs. And depending on their water system, whether it's high or low or medium risk, but susceptibility wise, most risk assessors go, okay, it's probably a medium high. It's not the full, it's not the highest of the high, and it's not general public building. So it kind of sits in between. But yeah, say a little bit subjective.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
There was just a question in the chat. I'm not sure. I've not looked at the content of what Sarah's posted, but this rang true with me because in my previous employment we used to sometimes struggle with water temperatures, cold water temperatures, particularly in warm weather. And somebody's commented that you mentioned temperatures above 20 degrees as being a risk, but what happens when you're struggling with your cold water temperature?
Yeah, I guess this is a technical question, isn't it? So I know full well that the water companies won't get out their seat unless it's over 25. That's just the nature of it, and they won't be too bothered. Different parts of the country, particularly London, really struggle in the summer to get incoming water below 25 or anywhere below 20. And obviously, the further south, the warmer you get, the worse it is. So yeah, you kind of got some duff cards to deal with, to play with straight away. There is some things that you can do. So we need to make sure everything in the risk assessment is done. So if there's any risks to do with, if you have a cold water tank, is that heating up? Is that turning over? Is everything insulated as much as possible? Are outlets getting kind of a daily turnover? So if things aren't sitting there to warm up. And another thing that you can do is obviously if you keep a record of that incoming water temperature, so the first tap incoming into your building, what temperature is that after 2 minutes of running? There's your baseline. Then what you can do is use a 2-degree rule. So if you have then a cold water tank, making sure that stored water is no more than 2 degrees more than the incoming. It just proves that you've got turnover in that tank to keep that controlled. And then what you can also do is use a 2-degree rule again, from the tank to tap, or if it hasn't got a tank, straight from mains to tap. So after 2 minutes of flushing, running water, that temperature is within 2 degrees of the source. So what that does, it proves that you are controlling what you can control. So if something did happen and you said, look, we're getting temperatures coming in from the mains at 23, what chance have we've got? So we go, okay, prove that you are controlling yourself still. And you go, okay, that 2-degree rule is quite a good rule of thumb to go, we are doing what we can, here's the proof. Because if you then had temperatures that come out your tap at 29, it'll go, 7-degree difference is still a little bit iffy. It's not, you're not proving that you're doing what you can. So that's what I recommend to my clients in the summer. If you have a risk where actually that isn't quite good enough, that's when you look to bout and braces of biocides. There are lots of biocides out there that can be continuously dosed to try and do what temperature isn't. So a lot of places in, say, London will flick on the switch of the biocide during the summer because they no longer can keep it below 20. And we're also seeing an increase in recirculating cold water systems being thought about and designed. And then there's a new British standard coming out soon of how to install one. So that's going to help recirculate cold water, going back to a tank, and you can chill the tank. So that's something that the whole world is probably going to have to look at in this country, because cold water is getting warmer, isn't it? Buildings are better insulated, etc. So that's something that you'll see more of, particularly in big buildings.
That was great. Thank you. That's really useful. Okay, so if there's no more questions, are we done with the questions?
Yeah.
I don't think there's any additional ones in the chat. So
one thing I will add, Anna, actually, it didn't come up in the presentation, is about risk assessment review. It's all right, okay, if you haven't got a risk assessment, go and get one. And then when they're supposed to get reviewed. So in 2013, they took away the 2-year reassessment frequency of Legionella risk assessment to kind of align itself with all other types of risk assessment. You need to reassess when there's been a change. So if something's changed, change use of the building, you've changed the water system somehow, so risks have changed. So then you do a risk assessment. So they say review should be regular and ongoing. So you should be always reviewing what's in there and whether it's appropriate. And then any changes will then trigger a new risk assessment. So there's lots of companies out there that still use that 2-year rule. Is this hard and fast? We'll come later in 2 years' time to promote more work, essentially. But it should be saying this needs review regularly. If you have these changes, that's when you come do a reassessment. So that's quite an important point.
Okay, thank you. Although I worked in social housing previously, and depending on who your regulator is, that your 2-year rule was a hard and fast. So there will be lots of organisations still doing that as a minimum.
Yeah, it's kind of a comfort thing. They know they can plan it and they know when it's getting done, but I guess it might promote not good practice. I don't know, but yeah, it's good to be proactive, isn't it, rather than reactive, as we know. Yeah,
certainly. Okay, so thank you for that. Really appreciate your time, Charlie, today, and Sarah, for really busy in the chat. Thank you for that. So we'll close there. I'll just take this opportunity to plug our next CPD event, which is taking place in November. Just looking for the date. 28th of November at Staffordshire University. And that's going to be on fire safety. So please do look out for the LinkedIn comms and the comms from Staffordshire branch on that.
It is a face-to-face event, so it's not online, it's face-to-face, and you'll get a cup of tea and a coffee and a sandwich.
What's not to like? Okay, so that's great. And just remains for me to say the final plug really is just about, there'll be a questionnaire that should appear to you when you close down this screen, about how you found the CPD event. Really useful for the speakers, but also useful for the branch in terms of us understanding future events potentially and what we could do differently. So please do take the time to a couple of minutes just to do that questionnaire, and we'll close well on time. And thank you to everybody again for attending. Thank you to our speaker, and enjoy the rest of your day.